Hello, everyone. I am back. A pleasure to see you again. Now we are going to continue with the afternoon session for the Digital Economy Forum. So I am Choi Ji-young, who will be the MC for today. So following the keynote speech in the morning session, we're going to have another keynote speech in the afternoon session, which will be delivered by Mr. Andrew Wyckoff, who is the director for OECD Science, Technology, and Industry. And the presentation title will be COVID-19 and Digitally Induced Structural Change. So he is up on the screen, so we are now going to proceed with the presentation.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to participate in this prestigious conference. I only regret I can't be personally in Seoul today. It's my intent to use the keynote to kind of give you a bigger picture from the economic perspective, which we hold here at the OECD. But let me step back for a second. Many of us, certainly me, have been watching this digital transformation for many years, which in some ways has been going on for more than 50 years. And I actually started my career on something that looked like the upper left-hand corner piece of equipment. But we've seen a number of huge milestones over this time that have enabled us to really become a digital economy and society. And each of these has marked I think, a fundamental turning point in the road towards becoming a digital economy and society. And it's hard to predict what a technology is going to do. I think few would have predicted the impact of the smartphone on both the economy and the society. But most of the major transformations that have occurred so far have been technological in nature. It's been technology that has resulted in how business is conducted and the behavior of people. Now, just to contrast this, not everything we thought was going to be big turned out to be a huge seminal event 10 years later. Some things that were supposedly big things, I remember the Y2K crisis, have almost been forgotten by many, and were just a blip along the way rather than a seismic event. Now, the OECD has recently just completed a 2-year study that was a rather wide-ranging study that took stock of the digital transformation from what we call whole of government perspective. And by that, I mean, we engaged 14 different policy committees at the OECD. The committee from tax to trade to competition to education and 10 more. And we did this to assess how the digital transformation may have changed the nature of policymaking in each area. Now, the synthesis of our work is contained in these 2 volumes, which I refer you to. And I'd like to draw on this work for the next few minutes to talk about the broader impact of the digital transformation on our economy and society before thinking about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. To do so, I would argue you need to assess the nature of digital technologies and the properties of these technologies that are transformative for the economy. We've begun to do this in this paper listed below. And the reason for doing this is to ensure that the policies, many of which date to an earlier era, are fit for purpose in the digital era, which has quite different economic properties. These are the 3 main categories that we think are transformative in the digital economy. And we break these out into then 7 what we call vectors of different phenomena that affect the economy. I won't go through all of them today, but I'd like to talk about 3 that I think are particularly important in the context of COVID-19 and the structural change we see underway. The first of these is what we call scale without mass, which is a term borrowed from Eric Brynjolfsson, who's at Stanford. And it refers to the nature of digital products, that why they have fixed costs, their marginal costs are very low, sometimes close to zero. This combined with network effects, where as more people join an app, it becomes that much more useful and valuable, allows these digital products to reach massive global scale in a very short time. It's what some call winner take most outcomes. And they do so with comparatively little mass. And by mass, I mean buildings, people, things with a physical footprint. On their own. And this lack of a physical existence runs counter to many of the policies that we have in place, including that on taxation or labor laws. They presume you have a physical presence in a sovereign area. The second vector I'd like to talk about is what we call panoramic scope. And this is because digitally enabled products or firms tend to operate in many different markets or industries simultaneously, thanks to clever use of data and versatile software. Smartphone is a great example. It has everything from a phone to a camera, to a music player, to maps, to credit cards. And this allows what are called multi-sided business models, which further complicates regulations that are typically narrowly defined by specific sectors overseen by specific ministries. Now, the last one I want to talk about is what we call intangibles as a new source of value. And this reflects the fact that the notion of capital is changing, and with it, what constitutes a production function value creation. At university, I learned the production functions were about labor and capital being combined to produce things, and capital consisted of equipment, machinery or structures, and physical things that occupy real geographic space. But increasingly, firm value creation comes from intangible capital, like R&D or intellectual property or skills, organizational know-how, software, and data. This is well known in Korea. These intangibles are at the heart of purely digital firms, but increasingly are remaking traditional sectors like aircraft or agriculture or computing, where value is now derived from new services spun off of this capital. And this allows the intermingling, the blending of intangible capital with traditional tangible capital. Now, this is especially the case for another intangible asset, which I would argue is relatively new. And that is the arrival of data, but particularly big data, as an asset for the firm. And it gives huge competitive advantage to organizations that can harness it and exploit it. But it has some properties that are much different from other types of capital, such as it being what are called non-rivalrous. This means multiple users can use it at the same time without diminishing its value. It's non-depreciable. Old data can be very, very useful. And it's easily combined with other sources of data that further enhances its value. Now, having gone through that, and this is drawing from our Going Digital report, I now want to pivot and talk about COVID and the pandemic and the likelihood that we'll be dealing with this virus or its impact for some time. Now, the vectors of digital transformation that I just briefly described are becoming more important in the COVID era and are beginning to differentiate, I would argue, the winners from the losers. As the CEO of Microsoft has said, he feels we've seen 2 years worth of transformation in just a few months. And many have asserted we're at this inflection point where COVID is a catalyst for the digital transformation. And in fact, more fundamentally, I would say, the COVID epidemic and the need to maintain social distance and enact measures to limit contagion have had a very negative effect on sectors that enable mobility, such as cars or air travel. And even some parts of the digital ecosystem, like smartphones, that are predicated on mobility, enhancing mobility, have shown a decline. And this decline, Gartner just confirms this decline has persisted into the second quarter of 2020. And what we're seeing instead is a shift back to good old fixed lines, laptops, and desktop computers. And demand for real estate is fundamentally changing. I'm just zooming in here on New York City, where Manhattan apartment costs are dropping rather significantly. And contrary to this, we're seeing people go to the suburbs where there's now renewed demand for living at a distance and staying in place without interacting with others. Now, there are a lot of sectors that can enable social distance. And this is the structural change I think we're beginning to see. For example, telecom operators are seeing a surge in demand for all sorts of communications. And in fact, when we look at how data traverses the globe, and we do this by looking at internet exchange points, we see a huge surge in data flowing over the internet, up to 60% increase in some countries. But on average, somewhere around 1/3, 33%. And this is significant. To me, this is an indicator of the massless economy taking off, growing by 33% since just last September. And of course, this is well known to this audience. Some firms are doing very well. Here, I show the growth in Amazon's employment. Basically anything, a number of activities that require proximity are having difficulty, such as traditional bricks and mortar retail, while those that allow that same activity to happen at a distance, like e-commerce, are doing well. But I want to also say that part of Amazon's success is that panoramic scope, where they're not only a retail or a wholesale or a logistics provider, but they also are in the cloud computing business, advertising business, and entertainment, all of which are done at a distance. But it's not just Amazon. And I think e-commerce is interesting to look at. Maybe a less well-known firm from Canada called Shopify basically provides the ability for traditional retailers, particularly small and medium enterprises, to go online and have an e-commerce presence. And Shopify's new stores grew by 71% in the second quarter of 2020 compared to the first quarter. And basically, Shopify just supplies what I would call intangible capital. They supply the software, the organizational know-how, the skills, and tools for using data. And this allows these physical retail stores to create value while keeping at a distance. And these new methods allow value to be created at a distance. This is evident by today's conference. I'm coming at you from Paris, France, where new video meeting tools have now become ubiquitous and readily accepted as part of the new normal for work and learning. This is true for entertainment as well, particularly streaming entertainment. And by association, cloud computing has seen huge growth because it's the cloud that enables a lot of these new firms to scale up rather seamlessly and provide their services at a distance. And I think represents yet again another milestone in that path towards the digital economy and society on where we get our computing power. And again, this is largely intangible capital that's transformed traditional capital, like those servers, made them available at a distance to users who want them. And as you know, big tech, as it's called, is thriving. Either companies that supply these tools or are digitally enabled have done very well. And here's just a peek at revenue growth in Q2 2020 versus 2019. But it's not only in terms of revenue, which is the left-hand side, but more importantly, net income, which is the right-hand side, which enables these firms to do more R&D, move into new lines of businesses, or acquire existing firms to further their competitive strength. And I just want to begin to step back and just say, well, it's not all platforms are doing that well, and not all of big tech. And we've seen some firms that got a lot of notoriety, like Uber and Airbnb, but are predicated on mobility or travel that haven't done as well. And moving to the broader economy, we see some, I think, some warning signs, some flashing lights on what's happening in the COVID era. In general, we find that the COVID era basically enables those cash-rich firms or those firms that are already digitally enabled to do reasonably well. And they're coping, in some cases, as I said, even thriving. But traditional small businesses that do not have these deep pockets and can't convert easily to a distance business model are struggling. And we're seeing many go out of business. And equally worrying is the lack of new businesses, and that's what this graph shows, entering, where in these new businesses, these startups are traditionally a source of innovation, whose new approaches can challenge incumbents, keep the economy competitive, and markets dynamic. And these firms are also a source of new jobs. Indeed, young firms account for about only 20% of overall employment, but they create almost half of the new jobs across the OECD countries. We worry that should this downturn in new entrants persist, similar to the one that we saw during the 2008 financial crisis, it could lead to a lasting negative effect on jobs. Our estimates here indicate that a drop of new entrants of around 20%, which is what we're seeing, could result in a loss of 0.7% in the aggregate employment 3 years after the shock. And this persists still to 0.5% 14 years later. So it has this long-lasting effect if these firms don't come forward. Let me begin to conclude by returning to where I started, why COVID has undoubtedly accelerated aspects of the digital transformation. It's worth asking a sophisticated group like this one, will it be long-lasting? Or will it be a blip that we don't even think of 10 years from now? As longtime Silicon Valley observer Mary Meeker illustrates in this slide, technology frequently outpaces the ability of humans to adapt. It takes time. And as we can see, economists, we've labeled this tendency to reluctance to change habits as being sticky. As you can see, evidence of this across OECD countries where people rebel at being confined, they don't want to wear masks, and they would just want to return to a pre-COVID social behavior. In addition, many of the COVID restrictions reduce our convenience, which I'm always amazed is such a strong motivator of behavior, particularly in the digital world. So why I think some of the new modes of working and learning may persist and change how we do things, it may not be the sea change that some predict. And I expect we'll fall back to lower levels than we're seeing now, albeit higher than what we had pre-COVID. Let me just shift briefly to looking at innovation more broadly, beyond just the digital economy, because really the only way out of the pandemic will be through science. As time goes on, governments are shifting the focus from a reactive response to the crisis to now a proactive stance to inject resilience into the economy and society. And science is being recognized as being fundamental to building this resilience, not only for finding a vaccine, which this figure shows the money flowing into that, and other treatments, but as a long-term ability to address other global risks. And we have to include among those climate change. But we also know that investments in R&D, which is a proxy for me for science and technology, are very cyclical. And boosting our resilience at this time as the economies struggle may be difficult, and it may take a large public effort. Let me just conclude by drawing a few observations that I welcome your thoughts about. I think without question, COVID will be an accelerant, but maybe more of an evolution than a revolution. I worry a lot about business dynamism and hence innovation, which is much needed for injecting resiliency into our economies and societies. And this may decline as large incumbents do well and startups decline. But more broadly, I see a new era for intangible capital, as I say, things such as R&D and other digital capabilities that allow us to continue to do things at a distance, and these may gain over more traditional forms of capital. Let me conclude by saying the OECD has produced more than 135 different policy briefs. I recommend that you go take a look at a few, as well as some of the things from my part of the OECD on policy, and particularly artificial intelligence, which I know is a topic here today. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. That has been the keynote speech by Mr. Andrew Wyckoff for the second keynote speech. Thank you very much once again. We will use the same format of Q&A as we did in the morning. As you recall, what we have done is to have the conversation with Andrew, and I'm going to use English to have better communications, and you're going to listen to the Korean interpretation.
Excellent keynote speech, and then it was so informative, and it's got a lot of, food for thought for us. So now let us start our Q&A session here. Okay, so first question, you mentioned big tech is thriving. I mean, of course, some big platforms, as you said, are struggling to survive, just like an Uber and Airbnb. But we've also recently witnessed the really surge of the stock price of big tech companies. So, but do you think the exponential growth of this new technology can be shared equally among the big techs who basically have the resources to invest into those technology, and small firms who cannot afford?
Thank you, Josh. I appreciate that question. Yeah, I guess I would just confirm that, and I apologize to this audience, so many of my examples drew from U.S. firms or the U.S. economy, which are the best well-known. But I think more generally, large firms that have a real digital presence or are cash-rich and can continue to invest in R&D, and I know Korea is a world leader in R&D intensity, I think we'll come out of this looking pretty good. Where I do think there's a problem, and where we saw it even before COVID, where we can dissect productivity growth across the OECD by firms. And we saw even before this crisis hit that large firms at the frontier of technological capabilities, the productivity was very good. They were doing very well. And but at the other end, there was a huge tail of small firms that had very low productivity. And my fear is this crisis will act as a cleansing process whereby a lot of those small firms will have to exit or will have to merge with the larger firms to stay alive. And so I do worry that this will affect the competitiveness of markets and, as I said, future sources of jobs.
Right. Well, thank you very much for your answer. I mean, yeah, I totally agree that even small firms can have the benefits of, making all the complicated, conventional process, very simplified, and then they can actually enjoy the higher efficiency, and then that's also really, really important point that we have to pay attention to, I guess. And then the second question is also kind of big, $1 million question, I think. So the question is about the the global geopolitical structure, which means some experts said the pandemic may serve as a geopolitical inflection point. So some authoritarian countries would justify the use of technology to pursue their autocratic regime and try to make their own cyber sovereignty or something. While some other countries like the US or Europe, they differ on the nature and importance of privacy, the free speech and regulation on big tech. So of course, because they believe basically, internet should be open and interoperable, right? So do you think the virus can drive this kind of split of the world?
You're right. That's $1 million question.
Yes.
I don't know if the virus, from what I've seen, so I look at the digital governance globally rather closely. I'm not so sure if the virus and the response to COVID either makes it better or makes it worse. I think there's other factors forcing this. And you just mentioned a couple of them. Different values across different countries lead to different groupings. The OECD set of countries are what we call like-minded. They have one set of values, and in the conversations I've had with ministers of communication and information, as they use track and trace apps to help, including in Korea, is that protecting privacy is a pretty fundamental part of engendering trust, which is needed for widespread adoption of these apps, which is needed to make them effective. So just to say, I think some of the digital politique that's going on has less to do with COVID and has more to do with more fundamental factors that have been around a long time.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. But as I said, it's a super big question, but it's really, really interesting in the topic. So yeah, let's move to some questions from the audience here. You mentioned, the next 10 years is a really crucial time for our humanity, but you also mentioned the human behavior as being kind of sticky. So what would be the necessary force to push people to accept this exponential digital transformation and change?
That's a good question too. So as I said, it's convenience. It would be my short answer. I think this is why the smartphone took off around the globe, because it was easy to use. We made it with apps, and you could use your fingers, you could carry it everywhere, and now it's become a fundamental part of most people's lives. And I think this is why people rebel against masks and limiting their mobility, because it's not convenient, even though which I find interesting, because there's a risk out there which they don't seem to be factoring in. And so in this regard, I think people have learned some lessons that, these tools can be very convenient, like what we're doing today. And as much as I would love to be in Seoul, I did save a fair amount of money, and the planet's probably better off, a lot less carbon in the air. So I think some of these habits will stick for a long time in jobs where they can. So we're going to see telework, and you've already seen a number of companies announce they're going to extend this. I think this is part of the change in real estate. People are looking for new dwellings where they can have a home office easily. And things like telemedicine, I think, have been proven to be, and I know this is on your program, to be very effective and convenient. Why why e-learning has struggled a little bit more. And I think there's active experimentation underway. And so what's useful about COVID is it, sorry, and I don't mean to make light of the tragedy that is going on, but it forces us to collectively react and adapt and test out a number of new approaches. And so I expect by the end of the day, we're going to have some new, and so I think some of it will stick, maybe not as much as we have now. People still like going to restaurants and bars and live entertainment and so forth, but a lot of it will persist on.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Yeah, it's very interesting. Okay, and another question here. In your presentation, it noticed that technology versus human adaptability needed faster learning and smarter regulation. Can you share your insight on any development points for Korea on regulations, or what smart regulation shall be required in general?
Yeah, so I want to seize on one part of this. So there is faster learning. I think governments need to be more agile and not hope to make a policy in 1 year that's going to last for 10. Instead, I think they need to use some of these digital tools in a clever way to iterate back, use the data coming off of things like smart sensors to say, hey, is that policy working or not? And if it's not, how do we change it to make sure it works? This is hard. Many policymakers aren't very technologically adept, and businesses like certainty. They don't want to see policies or regulations constantly changing. And this is why part of what came out of the Going Digital is during a period of transformation, which we're certainly in now, rather than having specific technical regulations, it may be better to have broader principles that allow businesses to move towards some goal without specifically being told how to get there or what not to do. And so I think this is, and part of it's about getting people who are technologically adept working closely with policymakers.
Thank you. Yeah. I also find quite interesting question here. I'm not sure whether this question is directly related to the topic that we are talking about, but I think it's worthwhile to explore. Okay. For last few decades, we have witnessed the really urbanization, which means that more and more people are moving to city because there are more chances for education and jobs, and all the technological benefits are available in the cities. And a lot of people also argue that more than half of the population, even 60%, I guess, of the population will be living in a city, while city only represents 3% of the total land of the earth. So, but the COVID-19 totally changed the way we live and basically like intact business. So, for example, if you can really access to the really high-level education remotely, or high-level, high-paid job remotely, does this urbanization still have the possibility to continue, or do you have any idea on how the urbanization continue?
Yeah, so we're in a period of a lot of uncertainty,
Yeah.
and I would be foolish to try to make a prediction here about urban real estate, and that's why I showed just what's happening in New York City in really the short term, and I presume maybe the same phenomenon is going on in Seoul and Tokyo and other parts of the world, and I do think that. Again, I hate to sound like what they call a two-handed economist, but I think it's going to be a blend. I think people are still going to love some of the amenities they can only get from a city, and the intensity and the culture and some of the unique opportunities that exist here. But they're also going to realize that there's some downsides, particularly contagion. And you're seeing an increase for more of a blend where people will try to mix, I think, now and then the urban amenities with those that it can be more at a distance. But again, I'm not a good person to ask. I am impressed though, how the infrastructure has allowed this to happen. Now, many OECD countries are still rather weak in getting out to more rural areas. And some of our countries like Australia have such a huge geographic expanse, it's almost impossible. And so I think there will be limits to this, but more generally, I would say the digital divide, which has been with us for decades, but was seen as kind of a smaller techie type policy issue, I think now has moved center stage. And so to me, it's more now the equivalent of having no or poor housing as a policy issue. To have no or poor connectivity, I think will be a fundamental issue that governments need to focus on and work with the private sector to try to resolve.
Great, thank you very much. Given the limited time we have, I think we have to finish now, unfortunately. Well, if you have any really last comments that you would like to give us, especially for Korean environment, and then, yeah, please give us a little bit of a comment from your side.
No, I think my main comment, and this is something that OECD's commented on a lot with Korea, is you have very successful large firms. Your smaller firms don't see the same productivity or dynamism of some of our other countries. And hence, during this period, this may be a good time to kind of be particularly attentive to them. That and, as I've said, some of the traditional manufacturing sectors on which you propelled your growth may be hitting some difficulty. And it will be more, I think, again, we're going to see things move towards an intangible nature, which tend to be more service-oriented than manufacturing. But with that, let me thank you for your attention and the opportunity to speak to you. And again, I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. All
right. Well, we thank you for your time, particularly it must be very early in the morning in your time. And then it was an absolute pleasure hearing from you today. So hope you have a good day and take care and bye-bye. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you for your attention. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. 네, 이렇게 해서 기조연설과 함께
So with that, we would like to wrap up the keynote presentation and the Q&A session.